guys, so let's discuss bebop scales. Now, bebop scales are actually quite simple. They're really just traditional scales or modes, like your major scale or your melodic minor scale or your mixolydian mode, but just with one chromatic passing note added to the scale. Now, before we get into what the scales actually are and the notes in each scale, let me explain to you why they exist. Now, you'll have to excuse me, but I'm going to have to make a few sort of generalizations here in order to explain why bebop scales exist. So, first generalization is most jazz songs, most sort of traditional jazz standards, are written in 4/4 time, so 4 beats per bar. Generalization number 2 is that most jazz improvisation runs are in quavers or eighth notes, and generally in a swung rhythm, so something like this. And so that means there are 8 notes per bar. 4 beats per bar, 2 notes per beat, so 8 notes per bar. Generalization number 3, which I suppose is a bit less controversial, is that the notes played on the beat generally sound stronger than the notes played off the beat. So 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. The notes on the beat, the 1, 2, 3, 4, generally sound a bit stronger and a bit louder and a little bit more accented than the notes off the beat, the notes in between the notes on the ands. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. And that's both because of the sort of natural rhythm that you have and the fact that we're swinging the rhythm, so the first note that you play, the note on the beat, is naturally a little bit longer than the note off the beat, which is a bit shorter, relatively. And the final thing to note, which is actually a fact rather than a generalization, is that diatonic scales have 7 notes. So your major and natural minor scales have 7 notes in them, in an octave. And so essentially the reason bebop scales came into existence is because of maths. So there are 8 notes per bar if you're playing in quavers, but only 7 notes in the diatonic scale. So if I were to sort of just do a simple run up and down, starting and ending on the root notes, I would have to do something like this. Right, so 8 notes to the top, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then to come back down, I have to repeat that same note, the C, to come back down and finish on this note. And the other thing to note is that when you're descending or going down with this little run, the notes that land on the beat are C, A, F, and D. And so 3 out of those 4 notes that land on the beat, the D, the F, and the A, are not in the chord tones, or not in the chord that I'm playing in the left hand, the C major 7 chord. And that means I'm accenting notes in my right hand that are not in the chord in my left hand. And that makes the whole little run sound a little bit harmonically weaker. Now, by adding an extra note, bebop scales effectively get rid of both of those problems. Alright, so now let's go through a few bebop scales. So now, technically, you can add in a passing note wherever you want, and as long as you just add in one passing note, you'll have 8 notes in a scale, and so you'll sort of avoid that mismatch between 8 notes per bar but only 7 notes in a scale. But over the years, musicians have kind of settled on one particular note that you add in for each of these specific bebop scales. So let's go through them all. So first we'll cover the bebop Dorian scale, and we'll play D Dorian, which is C major but starting and finishing on the D. And essentially the bebop Dorian scale adds an extra passing note between the 3rd and the 4th note of that scale. So you would go 1, 2, 3, sharp 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So that it sounds like this. Now the bebop dominant scale is a mixolydian mode, so we'll play G mixolydian to stay in the key of C major, with an extra passing note added between the flat 7th and the root. So it looks like this. So notice that the D bebop Dorian adds an extra F sharp, and the G bebop dominant also adds an extra F sharp. Now the bebop major scale is a regular major scale, but with an added passing note added between the 5th and the 6th note in the scale. So in this case, we'd get an A flat. So now let's play our little sort of ascending and descending run, but this time over the G7, so using the G mixolydian mode. And just playing the regular G mixolydian mode, going up and down in quavers, it'll sound like this. So to account for the one missing note in the regular sort of 7-note diatonic scale, I had to play this top G twice, then come back down, and then this bottom G twice again, sort of on beat 1 of the last bar to sort of finish it off. And again, notice that as I was descending, the notes that fell on the beat and are therefore a little bit more accented were G, E, C, A. Now, E, C and A again are not any of the chord tones in the chord G7. So now let's play this little sort of run up and down, but use the G bebop dominant scale and see what happens. Right, so this time we went up, but because we've got that extra note, we play an F sharp on the 4 and because it falls on an offbeat, it's not an accented note, so it acts as a passing note. Then we hit the G on bar 1, and we're not repeating it, we're not sort of anticipating the G. So 4 and 1, and then we go back down. And again we finish with 4 and 1. So we finish on the root note on beat 1 of the next bar. And notice this time that we're accenting the notes G, F, D, B, G. And so this time the notes that fell on the beat and the notes that we therefore accented a little bit are the notes that are found in the G7 chord. So now listen to the difference doing this as opposed to this. Now hopefully you hear that the second one is a little bit harmonically stronger, precisely because we are hitting the chord tones on the beat and because we hit the G not on the 4 and of the previous bar but on beat 1 of the next bar. And so those 3 scales, the bebop dorian, bebop dominant and bebop major, you can use over a 2-5-1 when you're improvising, and it works especially well if you're doing sort of stepwise improvisation, or sort of going up and down 1 step at a time. So then your improvisation can sound something like this. Right, so even though I was effectively just playing a scale up and then down 1 step at a time, which ordinarily would sound really boring in a solo, whereas when you play the bebop scale, because of these little passing notes, it gives the whole scale run a little bit more sort of harmonic intrigue and makes it a bit more interesting, because you're effectively playing an outside note, outside of the sort of diatonic key, really quickly on an offbeat, generally, before going back into the scale. So it makes it sound a bit more interesting. But also mathematically, because you're playing now an 8-note scale and you have 8 notes per bar, it just sort of fits nicer and it just makes the scale sound like it fits the time signature better. Cool, and so essentially you can just add in 1 extra chromatic note into any 7-note scale that you're playing, and if you're playing in quavers in 4/4 time and therefore have 8 notes per bar, it just makes the whole scale or a little scale run fit a little bit nicer by having that sort of symmetry with the 8 notes in the scale and the 8 beats per bar. So those 3 that I just went through are essentially the main ones that are used because of that 2-5-1 shape, which is the most common chord progression in jazz. But there are other scales, like up here I've written the bebop melodic minor scale, which again is the regular melodic minor, but just with an extra added chromatic note between the 5th and the 6th. So again you'd have an A flat in there. But really you can sort of play around with whatever 7-note scale you're playing. You can chuck in whatever chromatic note you like and see how it sounds, and effectively you've got a quasi bebop scale because of it. Cool guys, thanks for watching. That's it for this lesson. Again, feel free to leave any questions or comments. See ya!